Hello, my name is Sophia, and for my disease project, I have Legionnaires disease. So let's go ahead and get into it. So, a general overview of, I guess, what we're going to talk about today are the causes and spread of this disease, diagnosis and symptoms, treatment and prevention, and then I don't think you can see it because I'm covering it, but our fourth topic is going to be Pontiac fever, which is related to this disease, and then we'll go into the history because the history of the disease is really interesting. So, getting into the causes and spread of this disease is caused by the bacteria Legionella pneumophila, and it's primarily found in water sources. So, when we're talking about water sources, this includes hot tubs, shower heads, sinks, like decorative things like fountains, cooling towers, and large, complex plumbing systems. So, it was in nature found in water sources and dirt. And so whenever we started creating these man-made water sources, it became a health concern because it would enter the man-made water sources and then it would infect people. So how does it exactly infect people? So this disease is spread by water droplets that are inhaled from the said water source. So if your shower head were to contain the bacteria, then inhaling water droplets from your shower head would bring the bacteria into your body system and infect you. That's the primary and like main source of spreading, but it's also possible for the disease to spread from person to person. This is really rare, but it is possible. And it's also another really rare form of spread is to drink water that contains the bacterium. This is really rare because it's not necessarily ingesting the bacteria that makes you sick. It's like, when water goes down the wrong pipe and then you kind of like choke on your water. It's like that. Water goes down the wrong pipe and then the water that has this bacteria enters your lungs and all of a sudden you're infected. Moving along, let's go into how they diagnose this and some of the symptoms of this disease. So, some symptoms of Legionnaires' disease are cough, muscle aches, headache, shortness of breath, and fever. Some other not as common symptoms of this disease are like GI issues like diarrhea. It takes 2 to 14 days after exposure for symptoms to show. And as you notice, the symptoms are pretty similar to pneumonia. So bringing up pneumonia, I have 2 photos of healthy lungs over here where I think you can see my cursor. Those are healthy lungs. And then we can see over here someone who has Legionnaires' disease. You can see like all of the phlegm in their lungs. This is not good. It really, really messes with your respiratory system. So that brings us into diagnosis. The 2 most common diagnosis routes are a urine sample and then a lab test with phlegm, but the diagnosis can be further confirmed with a chest x-ray where, as you can see here, you can see that they have pneumonia based on how cloudy their lungs look. So moving into treatment and prevention, the most common treatment, and honestly the only treatment that like really works and is super important is antibiotics. Almost everyone who gets infected with Legionnaires' disease needs to be put on antibiotics, and they also typically need to be hospitalized. 1 out of 10 people who obtain Legionnaires' disease will die due to complications. These complications include like lung failure, which of course leads to death. However, those 9 out of 10 people do make a healthy recovery. And in terms of who's at risk, it's pretty similar to like COVID, where it's people who are older, people who have pre-existing conditions like heart issues, asthma, etc., all of that stuff. That's who's typically at a higher risk for this kind of disease. So to prevent the spread of Legionnaires' disease, it's mainly like maintaining and managing water systems, right? Because that's how it spreads. So when I was doing research over this, the CDC had like a long list of basically kind of checklists that people who have water systems, like those who run hotels, those who like run water systems for cities, can go through to make sure that they are going through the routine checks that are ensuring that their water source is not infected. And it just really boils down to taking precautions and being proactive in making sure that your water source and what you're giving your people is clean. Moving along, let's go ahead and start talking about Pontiac fever. So Pontiac fever is included in this presentation because it is related to Legionnaires' disease. And to kind of sum it up in a sweet way, it's a milder infection than Legionnaires' disease. So symptoms of Pontiac fever are, of course, fever, muscle aches, and no pneumonia. That was what was really interesting, is that the symptoms that Legionnaires' disease is mainly focused on pneumonia, right? Like that's one of the leading symptoms. This one, not so much. And it actually begins to like show in the body quicker than Legionnaires' disease. It begins anywhere from a few hours after exposure to 3 days after exposure, and the symptoms will last about a week. So similar to Legionnaires' disease, it's diagnosed with a urine or blood test. However, false negatives are common with this. And it's typically diagnosed and like recognized as a possible like illness whenever there have been other known cases of Legionnaires' disease infection or like a Legionella pneumophilia outbreak in an area. Then doctors will know, well, if you're showing these symptoms, then you most likely have Pontiac fever. Other than that, it's like not exactly a very common disease. So in terms of treatment and complications, when I had looked into this, it had seemed like it really doesn't need as much treatment as Legionnaires' disease. According to the CDC website, Pontiac fever goes away without requiring treatment. So it really is just a milder infection of Legionnaires' disease. So now let's get into the very interesting part, or at least for me, the history of Legionnaires' disease. So this all started way back then in 1976 at a bicentennial 4th of July Legion convention in Philadelphia. They were having this really big celebration to celebrate the bicentennial 4th of July. And they had a lot of people come in. They had Legionnaires, they had a lot of World War I veterans, and everyone was staying in this really big, beautiful, gorgeous hotel called the Beauvais Stratford Hotel, and there was 600 people who were going to this convention staying at this hotel for 3 days. And they started to notice that a lot of people were getting sick with severe pneumonia symptoms, and it ended up really just excelling to 221 people with severe symptoms and 34 people dead. So basically, there was a huge epidemic. And because there was an epidemic, of course, the CDC was sent out. And when the CDC was sent out, they couldn't really find anything that connected the illness to the environment. And that's when people kind of started to worry. So this led to lots of confusion and speculation, which I guess for me, I found the most interesting, like kind of not funny because this is of course something serious, but just really interesting. So some of the reasons that people thought this epidemic had happened were domestic terrorism, a CIA experiment that had gone awry. Some people thought that it was a hoax and it was designed to try and get people to get the swine flu vaccine. Sounds kind of familiar. There was a toxologist from Philadelphia who thought it was nickel carbonyl poisoning. And the last two were toxic fumes from photocopy machines, and my personal favorite, an attack from extraterrestrial forces. So it genuinely, nobody had an idea what was going on. They couldn't figure out what was the source of this illness, and people were really just going crazy trying to figure out what it was. So then, finally, 6 months later, Legionella pneumophilia is found, and it is found in December 1976 by Dr. Joseph McDade, who was a CDC laboratory scientist, and he had found and confirmed the bacteria as the source of the epidemic by using the technique of guinea pig inoculation and isolating the bacterium that caused the disease, which we now know as Legionella pneumophilia. So they weren't ever able to confirm this because of the like large amount of time that had passed, but they had speculated and hypothesized that the cooling towers for the AC that everyone was staying, like for the hotel that everyone was staying in, was the water source that had been infected and caused the illness. So then finally in April 1977, the CDC publishes the disease as the official name and cause of the 1976 Philadelphia outbreak. So it is finally like confirmed and written in the books. This is what got everybody sick. And of course, this is a really important finding, right? Because now we know that we need to take precaution over maintaining the cleanliness of our water sources. And it's something that we can look to now and identify the disease and make sure that we help those people when people are infected because we know about it. So, like, that's kind of the importance of this, right? But it also was able to assist in providing insight on the past and seeing what had happened in the past and explaining that. So, here are some examples of what we think now were actually Legionnaires' disease outbreaks. So, in Austin, Minnesota, in 1957, 78 people who were working at the city's one of the city's food corporations and meat packaging plants developed pneumonia. They think that this wasn't pneumonia and that it was in fact Legionnaire's disease. And then in 1965 in Washington, D.C., at a psychiatric hospital, 81 patients developed pneumonia and 14 of them died. And when the CDC had found out about Legionnaire's disease, they had went back and looked into these patients, and analysis of like stored specimens from those deaths showed that a number of patients had the Legionnaire, like elevated levels of Legionnaire's disease, like bacteria in them. So the Legionella pneumophilia were found in the bodies of those who had passed. And similarly, this had occurred in the Pontiac, Michigan Health Department in 1968. And what had happened was 144 visitors and employees of the Pontiac, Michigan Health Department developed a relatively mild illness that was called Pontiac fever. It was determined then that the disease was not caused by any known environmental allergens, toxins, or viruses. However, serum from those with Pontiac fever was also found to contain the antibodies to the Legionella pneumophilia. So the spread of the disease was traced to a leak in a building's air duct that allowed water from the air conditioning system to enter the building's atmosphere. So this was just going on to further confirm that Pontiac fever and Legionnaire's disease were not, for this, I guess, the example of Michigan, not just environmental toxins or allergens, but caused by a bacteria. So what a lovely and interesting history. Anyways, that is all. Thank you so much for listening. I can't wait to watch everyone else's videos, and I hope you learned a lot about Legionnaire's disease. Bye.